Welcome back to the deep dive. Today we are really strapping in for a high-stakes tour of the geopolitical chessboard. We're looking specifically at how the global order is being, well, fundamentally rewritten right now, immediately following that really consequential 2024 U.S. election. The source material we're digging into today is dense. I mean, it covers everything from these big philosophical debates in Sochi all the way down to the nuts and bolts of global payment systems. So our mission is crystal clear. We need to understand the structural challenges to, let's call it, Western-led global dominance. And crucially, understand the emerging financial and institutional alternatives that are, rapidly defining the landscape of 2025. This isn't just theory, folks. This is like the live blueprint for the next decade being drawn up. Okay, let's unpack this.
And the precise timing, as you said, of the core source material. That's perhaps the most critical element here. We're really analyzing the events surrounding November 7, 2024 in Sochi, Russia. Specifically, the 21st Annual Valdai International Discussion Club. You really cannot overstate the diplomatic significance of that exact date.
Why is that date so crucial? Remind us again.
Because it falls literally right after the confirmed victory of Donald Trump in the U.S. presidential election.
Got it. Okay.
Exactly. So this Valdai address, delivered by Vladimir Putin, it wasn't just some standard policy speech, not at all. It was a highly visible, very carefully structured diplomatic signal, delivered right at a key inflection point. Think of it as Russia's definitive statement on the new global reality. And it was tailored, very much tailored, to the incoming administration in Washington. But maybe even more importantly, it was tailored to audiences in Beijing and, the wider global south.
Okay, and the core message.
The core thesis articulated in that address, and look, this is the foundational belief underpinning everything else, the BRICS expansion, the accelerating race to de-dollarize, is that the unipolar era, that period of pretty much unquestioned dominance by the United States, is irreversibly passing away.
Yeah.
And importantly, this isn't framed as a wish or a hope. It's presented as the historical inevitability that Russia is, well, prepared to champion.
Okay, let's start there. With the grand vision, the sort of philosophical justification Putin laid out, because he used this platform not just to talk policy, right? He went deep into historical framing, positioning this current global shift as something genuinely epoch-making.
Oh, absolutely.
Yeah.
He certainly did. He deployed these really sweeping historical analogies to elevate the moment, comparing today's global transformation to huge watershed moments like the French Revolution of 1789
Wow.
and the Russian Revolution of 1917.
Those are not minor comparisons. He's suggesting total systemic collapse and reorganization is underway.
Precisely. By using those specific dates, 1789 and 1917, he's implying the change is potentially violent, sudden, complete, not just, incremental negotiation around the edges.
Right.
And furthermore, he claimed that this emerging world order is unprecedented, fundamentally different even from major historical settlements, like the post-Westphalian Order of 1648, which, defined state sovereignty as we knew it, or the Yalta system from 1945, which basically created the Cold War boundaries.
Yeah.
By sort of discarding these foundational historical precedents, he's essentially arguing that the rules of the game are being written pretty much from scratch now.
Okay. And what are the themes driving this? According to Russia, what's making it unprecedented?
Well, the core themes Russia insists are driving this shift are sovereignty, first and foremost, then cultural diversity and the rise of new centers of power, particularly in Asia, Eurasia, and the global south more broadly. And for Russia, this isn't just about diplomatic preference. It's about establishing what they specifically termed multipolarity as an ethical imperative.
Right, that phrase, ethical imperative, that's the hook, isn't it? Especially for the global south. It reframes what could be seen as just a geopolitical power struggle into something moral. How did he define that ethical imperative? What does it mean in practice?
Well, Russia is positioning itself as the principal champion of a, quote, fairer global order. And this order is supposedly grounded in sovereign equality, meaning every nation's sovereignty is equal, regardless of economic or military might and cultural pluralism. This framing directly appeals to nations who are, frankly, weary of being told how to run their domestic affairs by external powers.
Yeah, you can see the appeal.
And the contrast he presented was stark.
Yeah.
Multipolarity, in this view, is the path to sovereign equality and respect. The alternative, according to the speech, is the risk of descending into either aggressive anarchy, where, weak states just get exploited,
Right.
or into new forms of tyranny.
Okay, we need to pause there. New forms of tyranny. The sources we looked at are pretty clear this is a direct, though implicit, critique of Western policy tools, isn't it? Specifically economic coercion.
Absolutely, 100%. When Moscow talks about tyranny in this context, they are absolutely pointing fingers at the use of Western sanctions regimes. They're talking about the freezing of sovereign assets, like what happened to Russian central bank reserves, and what they label as external dictation in internal political affairs.
So the message is the unipolar world uses finance and law as weapons.
Exactly. That's the narrative. A unipolar world weaponizes finance and law, whereas a multipolar world respects national boundaries, cultural choices, sovereignty. And this ethical framing, this moral argument, is why the narrative finds such fertile ground across large parts of the global South, where memories of colonialism are still quite fresh, and recent experiences with conditional aid from Western institutions haven't always been positive.
So it's about modernization, but on their own terms, not adopting a Western model wholesale.
Yes,
Mhm.
precisely. They highlighted this focus on balance. Achieving modernization, achieving economic progress, yes, but without abandoning humanistic principles or traditional values or national identity. They are consciously trying to debunk the idea that development must equal Westernization. It's a very philosophical framing, but also strategically a very potent appeal.
Okay. Now, here's where it gets really interesting, as you flagged earlier.
Yeah.
The immediate political dimension. The
Yeah.
signaling around the Trump factor. The timing of Valdai right after the election meant discussion of the U.S. result was unavoidable. So what specific signals did Putin send during that Q&A session? That's what made headlines.
Yeah, the Q&A session absolutely dominated the news cycle globally. Because of the direct signals sent to the incoming U.S. president, Putin went, well, quite a bit beyond just standard diplomatic formality. He offered specific, quite personal praise for Trump. Well, he commended Trump's courage during that assassination attempt back in July 2024. The sources note that Putin described Trump's reaction, that instinctive, defiant reaction, as a reflex that exposed his, quote, true character under extraordinary stress. This kind of highly personalized praise, it's a calculated diplomatic tool, right? It humanizes Trump in the eyes of the Russian establishment, maybe their public too, and it sets a tone of potential respect, perhaps not trust yet, but respect.
That's a strong personal overture, yeah. But what about actual policy openings, especially on Ukraine and the broader U.S.-Russia relationship, which are, core to the current global instability?
Right. Well, he noted that Trump's campaign pledges, specifically the stated commitments to restoring U.S.-Russia relations and finding some kind of resolution to the Ukraine conflict, absolutely deserve attention. That was the phrase. So that's a clear signal, an acknowledgement that dialogue is desired and may be seen as possible.
But there was a catch, wasn't there? A balancing act.
Oh, definitely. The signal was very carefully balanced. While he affirmed Russia's readiness for dialogue, using the line, "We will work with any head of state who has the trust of the American people," he immediately added this subtle yet quite firm challenge. He reminded the audience that, following the escalation of the conflict in 2022, many Western leaders had simply stopped calling, stopped engaging. And he concluded with that rather pointed observation that Russia is alive and well without them.
So it's an invitation, but with conditions.
Exactly. It's an invitation to negotiate, yes, but it comes with a clear prerequisite. Recognize Russia's current position. Recognize its perceived strength and its independence. Dialogue is possible, but only, it seems, on these new multipolar terms.
Okay, that sets the philosophical stage and the immediate political context really well. Now let's move from the theory to the actual strategy. If Russia is preparing to engage with a potentially transactional Trump administration, it has to define its hard limits, its red lines. What was the biggest strategic red line laid down in the sources we examined?
The most critical strategic signal, arguably, was the flat-out rejection of any potential anti-China pivot. This wasn't subtle at all. It was directly addressed when a Chinese scholar in the audience asked this very specific hypothetical question about Trump perhaps proposing a U.S.-Russia alliance specifically to, quote, compete with China.
Ah, like a modern replay of the 1970s Nixon-Mao detente, but in reverse.
Exactly that implication. And the response was, well, immediate and firm. A clear rejection.
Why shut that down so quickly and publicly? What's the analysis there?
Putin stressed that the Russia-China partnership is not directed against any third party. That's the standard line, but he emphasized it. He framed it instead as a pillar, maybe the pillar, a permanent foundation of an independent, cooperative world order. This is vital for several reasons.
Okay, what are they?
Well, first, just pragmatically, it secures Russia's massive eastern flank. It guarantees a degree of stability across Eurasia, which allows Moscow to focus its strategic attention elsewhere, like towards Europe or the Middle East. Second, and this is crucial in the context of potentially engaging Trump, it preserves Moscow's maximum negotiating leverage with Washington. By declaring the China partnership essentially non-negotiable, Russia is telling the U.S. upfront, any dialogue, any potential rapprochement will not come at Beijing's expense. This simultaneously reassures China that Russia is a stable, committed partner, which further solidifies the core of this emerging multipolar bloc. It's a message to both Washington and Beijing.
So he's signaling continuity here. This isn't just a sudden reaction to Trump, but part of a longer-term strategy. Did he connect this moment to previous shifts in Russian foreign policy thinking?
Yes, he deliberately drew those parallels. The sources specifically recall how the foundation for today's whole multipolarity discourse was arguably laid almost 2 decades earlier, back in 2007 at the Munich Security Conference. That was the moment Putin first really publicly forcefully denounced U.S. unilateralism and the whole concept of a unipolar world. So by referencing 2007, he's illustrating that this policy hasn't just been reactive, it's been a consistent strategic ambition building over time.
Right. And there was another parallel drawing, wasn't there, to Cold War history, signaling a kind of pragmatic engagement even amid rivalry.
Yes, that comparison to Cold War détente, specifically thinking about the Brezhnev era in the 1970s, is highly revealing. Brezhnev's policy, remember, involved pragmatic engagement with the U.S. on specific issues, like arms control treaties, even while the fundamental structural rivalry of the Cold War persisted fiercely underneath. So by drawing this parallel, Putin seems to be signaling that Russia is prepared for similar pragmatic engagement with the incoming Trump administration on specific issues. But, and this is the key part, the underlying structural systemic rivalry over the future world order, this clash between multipolarity and unipolarity, that will remain completely non-negotiable from Russia's perspective.
That duality, the big philosophical framing in the main speech, followed by this more pragmatic, flexible policy signaling in the Q&A, seems really key to understanding the complexity of Russia's position right now. Let's maybe use that comparative table that was in the source material to try and synthesize where Russia actually stands globally compared to the other major power blocs in 2025.
Yeah, that table is useful. You can really see the differences starkly when you contextualize Russia's position. Let's look at the core vision first. Russia, as we've said, champions sovereign equality and is explicitly anti-Western dominance. That's their flag. Now, contrast that with the U.S. post-2024 election. The focus seems to be much more on transactional deals, America first maybe, and fundamentally retaining economic primacy. China's vision is articulated around its community of shared future for mankind, which, implies a carefully managed polycentric system where China naturally holds considerable weight, maybe even a central coordinating role. And the EU, well, the EU is still grappling with achieving genuine strategic autonomy, trying to find its place, balancing between these competing giants. It's a tougher spot.
And the diplomatic style, the actual tone and rhetoric used, seems just as important as the core policy differences. They sound very different.
Oh, absolutely. The style reflects the substance. Russia's rhetoric is often described as philosophical, almost civilizational. It's anti-hegemonic, constantly invoking deep history, moral arguments against external interference. Very grand.
Yeah.
Contrast that with the U.S. tone, which, especially under Trump perhaps, tends to be highly transactional, competitive, focused on immediate nationalist interests and winning deals. Much more direct, less philosophical. China often relies on this sort of long-term, Confucian-influenced rhetoric, emphasizing harmony, stability, win-win cooperation, even as its actions can be quite assertive. And the EU, often by necessity, sounds cautious, technocratic, focused on bureaucratic processes and finding internal alignment among its many members.
Okay, let's zoom in on that crucial dimension, sovereignty, because that's the central rallying cry for Russia and the BRICS coalition. How do the major powers actually differ in how they apply the concept of sovereignty?
This is where the core disagreement, or hypocrisy as Moscow might frame it, really lies. Russia demands a very robust, almost absolute interpretation of sovereignty. No external dictation, no externally imposed sanctions, and certainly no regime change efforts orchestrated from outside. Hands off. China similarly demands absolute sovereignty, often using it as a shield to defend its internal policies on things like Hong Kong, Taiwan, or Xinjiang from international criticism.
Right.
The U.S., by comparison, historically and currently, practices what could be called selective sovereignty. It strongly champions the sovereignty of its allies when they're under pressure, like Ukraine currently. But it reserves the right, often citing democracy promotion or national security, to economically or even militarily intervene in states it deems hostile or unstable. And sanctions are the primary tool of economic coercion used to enforce this selective approach.
So that fundamental difference how sovereignty is defined and whether it applies equally to all states, that's the core of the appeal Russia's making.
Exactly. That's the wedge issue Russia uses when it seeks to align what it calls the global majority against the traditional Western bloc led by the U.S. It's a powerful message. They don't respect your sovereignty. We do.
Okay, so we've got the philosophical justification for multipolarity laid out by Putin at Valdai. Now, the big question is, how is this vision actually being institutionalized? How is it being made real? And that seems to be the primary function of BRICS. It's the institutional blueprint for this emerging new order.
Yeah, the transformation of BRICS is really quite staggering when you look back. It started, remember, back in 2001 as just a catchy acronym coined by an investment banker at Goldman Sachs to describe promising emerging markets: Brazil, Russia, India, China. South Africa joined later.
Right, just an investment term initially?
Yep, exactly. But by 2025, especially following this massive expansion phase in 2024, it's become a structured political and economic coalition. It now represents, what, over 40% of the world's population and nearly a third of global GDP, measured by purchasing power parity. It's huge. It is arguably the principal engine driving this structural shift away from G7 dominance.
So what were the key institutional milestones? What proved that BRICS was becoming more than just a talking shop, that it was actually creating a credible counterweight architecture?
The critical steps, the ones that showed serious intent, were primarily financial. They were designed quite deliberately to create parallel structures to the existing Western-dominated system. First, back in 2014, they founded the New Development Bank, or NDB.
Right.
This was created explicitly as an alternative to the World Bank. Its mandate is to fund infrastructure and sustainable development projects within BRICS members and other emerging economies.
And it's the governance structure of the NDB that truly makes it an alternative, isn't it? Not just the money.
Absolutely spot on. The NDB was founded on the core principle of equal voting rights for all founding members, regardless of how much capital they contributed.
Which is totally different from the Bretton Woods institutions.
Totally different. It contrasts sharply with the IMF and the World Bank, which operate on these weighted quota systems. There, the largest contributors, the U.S., Japan, Germany, etc., hold disproportionate influence, sometimes even effective veto power. So think about it from the perspective of a developing nation. Having equal voting rights in the NDB means your project proposals are theoretically judged more on merit and need rather than political alignment or the strategic interests of a handful of large economies. It's the practical application, you could say, of that sovereign equality principle Putin was talking about at Valdai.
Okay, that's the NDB. And the second critical parallel institution they set up?
That was the Contingent Reserve Arrangement, the CRA, established around 2015. The CRA basically functions as a liquidity safety net for member states. Think of it as analogous to the IMF's role. If a member state faces a sudden balance of payments crisis or a severe liquidity shortage, they can draw upon the CRA pool of funds.
But again, the crucial difference lies in the conditionality, right? The strings attached to the money.
Precisely. IMF loans, historically, often come with very stringent conditionalities. These often involve demands for structural economic reforms, deep budget cuts, privatization of state assets, things that can be politically very painful.
And seen as infringing on sovereignty.
Exactly. For many developing nations, these conditions are often perceived as direct infringements on their national sovereignty and policy space. The CRA, while it still requires financial prudence from borrowers, is designed to minimize or even eliminate those politically charged economic conditionalities. It aims to offer a genuine safety net that respects the sovereignty of the borrowing nation.
Okay, let's talk about the power of the expansion, because 2024 was really the pivotal year for solidifying this institutional strength. Who are the full members now, as of 2025?
Right, so by 2025, we have the original 5: Brazil, Russia, India, China, South Africa, plus the 4 major additions from the 2024 intake: Egypt, Ethiopia, Iran, and the United Arab Emirates, the UAE.
That's a significant expansion, geographically and economically diverse.
Hugely significant. This expansion gives BRICS an unprecedented geopolitical footprint. It spans key emerging markets across South America, Africa, the Middle East, and Asia. It really covers a vast swath of the globe now.
And what does that collective strength look like in just sheer economic terms?
Well, we're now talking about an aggregate GDP for the 9 members exceeding $28 trillion. And a combined population base of around 3.5 billion people. That's massive. But the real story, perhaps, is the forward momentum. These 9 nations together are projected, according to IMF data referenced in the sources, to contribute something like 58% of all global growth between 2024 and 2029. So the center of global economic gravity is demonstrably shifting towards this bloc.
And they've also found a pragmatic way to keep growing, right?
Oh,
Without
yeah.
forcing every interested country to become a full member immediately, which could get politically complicated.
Yes, that was a smart move. They innovated with this new category, the partner country status. This was formally adopted at the Kazan summit in Russia in 2024. This tiered model allows for flexible inclusion and cooperation. It lets BRICS engage with the, 30-plus other nations that have expressed interest, including major economies like Indonesia, Turkey, Nigeria, Saudi Arabia, and others. It allows BRICS to leverage the resources and diplomatic weight of these potential future members without immediately getting bogged down in the complexity of achieving consensus governance among, say, 20 or 30 full members. It makes BRICS an infinitely scalable platform, in theory.
So, institutionally, beyond just economic development and finance, what's BRICS's main geopolitical function? It clearly seems designed as a tool to change the global rules of the road.
Yeah, explicitly. It is positioned as a collective diplomatic platform. Its stated goal is to challenge Western hegemony and, maybe more practically, provide a degree of collective protection against things like unilateral sanctions. They use the platform consistently to call for fundamental UN reform. Specifically, they keep demanding the expansion of the UN Security Council to include permanent members from Asia, Africa, and Latin America, arguing the current structure doesn't reflect the modern distribution of global power.
Let's quickly analyze the strategic value of those new members added in 2024. Iran obviously brings significant energy leverage and a strong anti-Western stance. But what about the UAE and Egypt? What do they add to the mix?
The balance is crucial, I think. Iran definitely strengthens that explicit anti-Western pull within BRICS. It brings massive natural resources, particularly oil and gas, and a very clear geopolitical posture hostile to the U.S. However, the UAE is different. It's a major global financial hub, a center for logistics, and a key player in OPEC plus Karachi. Its inclusion signals BRICS' ambition to tap into global capital flows, financial innovation, and energy markets. It's more economically integrated globally. And Egypt. Critically, Egypt controls the Suez Canal, one of the world's most vital maritime choke points for global shipping, connecting the Mediterranean and the Red Sea, Europe and Asia.
Strategic location.
Hugely strategic. So the expansion wasn't just about adding numbers or GDP. It seems to have been about strategically acquiring influence or direct partnership with countries controlling critical energy resources, major financial centers, and vital global trade routes. It's geopolitical chess. Okay, so this next section moves us from the sort of institutional structure to the practical economic combat zone, if you will. This shift toward de-dollarization, it's arguably the most politically charged and potentially the most economically consequential initiative emerging from this new multipolar order that BRICS is trying to build.
And the main driver, the sources suggest, is basically self-defense, right? Triggered by the perception or reality of the U.S. weaponization of the dollar through sanctions.
Exactly. The increasingly frequent and far-reaching use of unilateral U.S. sanctions against states like Russia, Iran, Venezuela, North Korea, and others, that's what transformed de-dollarization from, an academic talking point or nationalist rhetoric into a genuine strategic, almost existential necessity for BRICS members and others seeking insulation from U.S. financial pressure.
And Trump 2.0 accelerated this.
Well, the key takeaway from the sources covering late 2024 and early 2025 is that the uncertainty surrounding the incoming Trump administration, with campaign promises of new, potentially sweeping tariffs and maybe even more aggressive sanctions, significantly accelerated this drive. Countries started hedging their bets more seriously. We saw concrete evidence of this in the declining global trust in dollar assets. Foreign holdings of U.S. treasuries, once considered the ultimate safe haven asset, reportedly fell to just 30% of total outstanding treasuries. That reflects a significant flight from dollar-denominated assets, particularly by central banks looking to hedge against future economic coercion or financial instability originating from the U.S.
Okay, just to set the context, let's quickly remind the listener of the historical peak of the dollar's dominance so we can really appreciate the scale of the current erosion, even if it's partial.
Sure. The dollar's post-World War II dominance was really built on two main pillars. First, the 1944 Bretton Woods Agreement, which basically established the dollar as the primary global reserve and settlement currency, initially linked to gold. And second, the petrodollar system that emerged in the 1970s, largely following the Nixon shock and agreements with Saudi Arabia, which effectively mandated that global oil be priced and traded primarily in U.S. dollars.
And this gave the U.S. the exorbitant privilege.
Exactly, that famous phrase. It granted the U.S. the unique ability to borrow cheaply in its own currency, run large trade deficits without immediate consequence, and conduct foreign policy by controlling the global payment rails, like the SWIFT network. By the peak in the 1990s, the dollar accounted for well over 70% of global central bank reserves. It was utterly dominant.
Okay. So what's the current status? Are we seeing a genuinely meaningful structural erosion of that dominance in 2025? Or is it still marginal?
Well, the sources suggest the erosion is becoming structural, and it's clearly deliberate policy for many countries now. The USD share of allocated global reserves has demonstrably dipped below 60%, and some projections cited suggest it could fall closer to 50% by 2030 if current trends continue.
That's a significant drop from over 70%.
It's a profound drop because it directly reduces the global demand for dollars, which weakens U.S. financial leverage and potentially increases its borrowing costs over time. And this decline isn't accidental. It's being actively driven by central banks, particularly in the BRICS sphere and the broader global south, engaging in what some analysts are calling a silent diversification or even a silent gold rush. They're reducing their exposure to the dollar and increasing holdings of gold, other currencies like the yuan or euro to some extent, and other tangible assets. They're effectively trying to shield their national wealth from U.S.-driven inflation, interest rate volatility, and, perhaps most importantly, the risk of future sanctions or asset freezes.
Okay, so if the dollar is being actively bypassed, what are the key practical mechanisms BRICS countries are actually using right now in 2025? Let's get into the how of de-dollarization.
Right. The most immediate and arguably most successful mechanism so far is boosting local currency settlements for bilateral trade. We're seeing critical trade routes almost completely switch away from using the dollar as an intermediary. The prime example cited is the trade between Russia and China. The sources state it's now conducted over 90% in their respective national currencies, rubles and yuan.
90%? That's huge.
It's a massive shift, practically eliminating the dollar from one of the world's major bilateral trade flows.
And India is also pushing this quite aggressively, isn't it?
Correct. India is moving rapidly, according to the sources, to expand rupee-based trade, particularly with energy suppliers in the Middle East and partners like Indonesia. Again, bypassing the need for USD conversion. But perhaps the most strategically significant move aimed at undermining the petrodollar system itself came in May 2025. That's when the BRICS energy ministers reportedly issued a joint statement endorsing the idea of conducting oil and gas trades using their local currencies.
Just endorsing the idea or actually doing it?
Well, the endorsement itself was seen as a major signal. It represents the first formalized collective challenge from a powerful bloc of producers and consumers to that U.S.-centric financial architecture for energy established back in the 1970s. Whether widespread implementation follows quickly is another question, but the intent is clear.
Okay, so direct trade settlement is one key mechanism. Beyond that, they're also leveraging their own institutional tools, like the NDB you mentioned earlier, to offer financial alternatives.
Yes, the New Development Bank is crucial here. To reduce dollar dependency in the massive area of infrastructure financing, the NDB is actively preparing, according to reports, to issue rupee-denominated bonds by 2026. Possibly other local currency bonds, too, like rand or real-denominated ones.
How does that help de-dollarization?
Well, it means, for example, a major infrastructure project in India could potentially be financed entirely in rupees, funded by investors buying these NDB rupee bonds. The loan would be dispersed in rupees, repaid in rupees, and the whole project executed without any direct exposure to the U.S. dollar market. This significantly lowers currency risk and transaction costs for the borrowing nation, making the NDB financing more attractive. It's a subtle but powerful way to build parallel financial infrastructure that operates outside the dollar system.
Right. Okay, let's now delve into the really cutting-edge stuff. Digital innovation. Because it seems like de-dollarization is now being significantly powered by new financial technology.
Absolutely. Technology is the key enabler, making rapid, large-scale, non-USD settlement truly feasible for the first time. BRICS nations are heavily involved in testing and promoting platforms like mBridge. That's the Multi-Central Bank Digital Currency, or CBDC, settlement project.
Okay, break down mBridge for the listener. How does it functionally bypass the traditional dollar-based system, like SWIFT?
Okay, so currently, if a bank in, say, China wants to send a large payment to a bank in, say, the UAE, that transaction typically has to route through correspondent banks, often based in New York or London. It usually settles in U.S. dollars, and the messaging travels via the SWIFT network. This whole process gives the U.S. significant visibility and potentially control or choke points.
Right, the SWIFT weapon.
Exactly. Now, mBridge aims to eliminate that intermediary step entirely. It allows the central banks within the participating network, which includes China, UAE, Hong Kong, Thailand, and potentially BRICS members, joining to settle transactions instantly between themselves. They use tokenized digital versions of their own national currencies on a shared blockchain platform. It provides real-time, potentially cheaper, and more transparent cross-border payments without touching the US dollar or the traditional correspondent banking system. It effectively cuts out the middleman and neutralizes the primary geopolitical leverage point of the SWIFT system.
Okay, that sounds potentially game-changing.
It could be. And furthermore, the sources we looked at confirm the pilot launch of an even broader BRICS blockchain payment system occurred sometime in mid-2025. The aim is for a system-wide rollout, perhaps by 2026 or 2027. This seems designed to facilitate even faster, cheaper, and more easily auditable international transactions directly between BRICS member commercial banks, again, making the existing, often slow and costly, correspondent banking network look increasingly obsolete for intra-BRICS flows.
Wow. Okay, finally, we have to talk about gold. This sort of ancient reserve asset seems to be making a very modern geopolitical comeback in this context.
It really is. The move, particularly discussed around Russia and China to test gold-backed trade settlements, is both highly symbolic and potentially profoundly practical. BRICS members, and countries aligned with them, are reportedly utilizing global vault networks, maybe in places like Shanghai, Dubai, possibly free zones in Africa, to facilitate trade that is ultimately backed by physical gold. This could effectively create a functional yuan gold or ruble gold dual system for certain large transactions, especially in commodities.
So the idea is that the yuan or ruble is used as the transaction currency, but gold acts as the ultimate anchor of value.
Exactly. The national currency is used for the day-to-day mechanics of the trade, but the value of that transaction is ultimately underpinned or perhaps even partially settled by a universally accepted, politically neutral asset gold. This positions gold, rather than the US dollar, as the ultimate trustworthy value anchor for international trade, at least within this alternative system. It directly undermines the USD's unique role as the sole global reserve and settlement asset.
Okay, this all paints a pretty compelling picture of, well, maybe not inevitable, but certainly determined dollar decline in certain spheres. But we absolutely have to acknowledge the internal challenges and contradictions within the BRIC system itself, because the dollar is clearly far from defeated, right?
Oh, absolutely. That's the critical balance that's often missing from the more triumphalist rhetoric you might hear from some BRICS officials. The reality on the ground is that the USD remains the default currency for global business. It still accounts for an estimated 80% of global trade finance, according to most sources. It's still the preferred unit of account for invoicing most global commodities, outside of specific bilateral deals like Russia-China or Russia-India energy flows. So a full replacement of the dollar in the short to medium term seems highly improbable. The network effects are just too strong.
And there are tensions within BRICS about this too.
Yes, significant internal tensions are reported. India and Brazil, for example, remain somewhat cautious about fully committing to a rapid de-dollarization drive. Why? Primarily because they are wary of simply exchanging dependence on the US dollar for dependence on the Chinese yuan. China currently accounts for something like 60% of the total GDP of the expanded BRICS bloc. Other major members like India fear inadvertently helping to create a Sino-centric financial system where they might have even less influence than they do in the current dollar system.
Trading one hegemon for another.
That's the fear. Furthermore, there's the core paradox. China, which is the primary economic engine driving this de-dollarization push, still holds the world's largest reserves of US dollars and US Treasury bonds. So even China is hedging its bets. It needs to maintain liquidity and stability within the existing dollar system, even as it actively works to build alternatives to bypass it. It's a very complex balancing act for Beijing, too.
Okay, let's try and synthesize these big trends for you, the listener. We've covered Putin's philosophical justification for a kind of post-Western world order emerging from Valdai. We've looked at the institutional growth of BRICS as the vehicle to execute that vision, and we've delved into the highly tactical financial maneuver of de-dollarization. So what does all of this add up to? What does it mean for global economics and geopolitics right now in 2025 and looking forward?
Well, I think the clearest conclusion is that you are witnessing the probably irreversible emergence of a hybrid system. The sources we reviewed seem pretty clear on this. The most likely outcome isn't some sudden catastrophic collapse of the dollar, despite the headlines you might see. Instead, it's a structural shift away from a purely unipolar, dollar-centric financial world towards a much more contested, polycentric landscape. It marks the end, perhaps, of uncontested U.S. financial dominance, leading to a kind of patchwork global system where different currencies, different payment rails, different trading blocs compete much more intensely for market share and influence.
Okay, a contested hybrid system. So if that U.S. dominance is being actively contested, what are the concrete implications for the traditional hegemon, the United States, operating within this new structure?
Well, the potential threats are significant and quite structural for the U.S. economy and foreign policy. First, there's the potential for rising U.S. borrowing costs over the medium to long term. If global demand for U.S. treasuries genuinely falls because central banks are diversifying their reserves away from the dollar, the U.S. government may eventually have to pay higher interest rates to finance its national debt. That has huge domestic implications.
Right.
Second, U.S. sanctions leverage, which has become arguably the country's primary foreign policy tool short of military action, is likely to be significantly weakened over time. If major economic players like China, Russia, India, maybe even the Gulf states, can increasingly bypass the dollar system using alternatives like Enbridge, local currency settlements, or even gold-backed trade, then the threat of being cut off from the dollar system simply loses much of its coercive power. And finally, some economists worry that significantly reduced global demand for dollars could mean that trillions of dollars currently held overseas might eventually flow back into the U.S. economy, potentially fueling domestic inflationary pressures down the road.
Okay, those are potential downsides for the U.S. What about the other side? For the BRICS members and the broader global South, what is the ultimate payoff for all this strategic effort, coordination, and institution building?
The payoff is tangible, or at least that's the goal. It's about achieving greater national autonomy and significantly increased collective bargaining power on the world stage. Some projections cited suggest that maybe 20% of emerging market trade could potentially bypass the dollar entirely by 2030 if these initiatives gain traction. That translates directly into greater economic freedom for these countries. It means potentially more insulation from Western financial shocks or monetary policy decisions made in Washington. And critically, it offers the ability to pursue independent foreign and domestic policy agendas with less fear of external financial coercion. It aims to deliver, in practice, on that promise of national sovereignty that Putin articulated so forcefully back at Valdai.
Okay, so ultimately, the sources seem to suggest a final critical question that emerges from this whole Valdai analysis and the BRICS strategy. Can this profound shift towards multipolarity actually deliver the stability, the fairness, the equilibrium that Russia and BRICS claim to be striding for? Or is there a risk that this competitive fragmentation of financial and geopolitical systems actually descends into more chaos, more competitive anarchy?
That really is the crux of the dilemma facing the world in 2025, isn't it? Multipolarity, by definition, means multiple centers of power are competing fiercely, not just economically, but also competing to write the rules of global governance for the 21st century. Moscow, Beijing, and others are trying to portray this rebalancing as an ethical, necessary path toward a more just equilibrium. But the process of getting there, driven as it is by sanctions and counter-sanctions, by trade disputes, resource competition, and the deliberate fragmentation of previously standardized financial systems, is inherently volatile and potentially destabilizing. The challenge, I think, for you, the listener, is realizing that we are currently living right through the messy, uncertain, chaotic middle ground of this historic transition. We're moving away from a known, albeit flawed, unipolar system towards a much more complex, untested, and potentially far more competitive collective one. #tag outro.
Well, we have completed quite the deep dive into this fascinating and, frankly, pretty revolutionary source material today. We've seen pretty clearly that the world has decisively moved past that end of history idea proclaimed decades ago. We are now squarely in what looks like the end of unipolarity. And Putin used that Valdai platform skillfully, both as a kind of lecture hall to frame history his way and as a signaling platform for future pragmatism. Welcoming dialogue with the U.S., yes, but making absolutely clear that Russia's strategic alignment with China and the global South is now a non-negotiable pillar of its foreign policy.
Exactly. And BRICS is the institutional architecture being built, brick by brick, for this new world order, underpinned by that very tactical and increasingly technological maneuver of de-dollarization. And the key takeaway on that front isn't necessarily that the dollar is going to collapse overnight. It's more about a deliberate, technologically enabled move toward a contested hybrid financial landscape, one defined by competing local currencies, maybe gold-backed systems for certain trades, and definitely proprietary digital platforms designed specifically to cut out the traditional Western financial middleman.
So the world is now learning, maybe the hard way, how to live in this highly contested, polycentric financial and geopolitical structure. The rules are definitely changing, and they're increasingly being written, or at least challenged, far away from the traditional Western capitals.
Mm.
BRICS members are taking very proactive steps to try and control their own financial destiny.
And that leads us, I think, to a final provocative thought for you to maybe mull over after this. If the global power of the U.S. dollar has historically been defined, at least in part, by trust in U.S. institutions, rule of law, market depth, and if Russia, China, and the broader BRICS coalition are now building these complex institutional alternatives like the NDB, the CRA, and technological systems like Enbridge, specifically designed to bypass the need for that trust in the U.S.-led system, then what specific non-financial sector might become the next critical global battleground where the rules get written or rewritten, primarily by BRICS rather than the G7? Think about sectors that require broad global standards and coordination. Maybe the rules governing the future use and ethics of artificial intelligence, or the development and regulation of space technology and resources. Could the multipolar struggle shift its main focus there once this financial frontier becomes more established? Something to consider.